The game of Magic is always evolving. New mechanics come and old ones wither and die. Today we're going to look at some mechanics from Magic's history that we're never going to see again and talk about the reason why. Before we get to the mechanics, you're probably wondering, why am I so confident that these mechanics are gone forever and never going to return? Well, Magic's head designer, Mark Rosewater, maintains this storm scale, which he uses to rank mechanics by the likelihood they'll make another appearance in the game. The scale goes from 1, which is for evergreen mechanics like flying or death touch that we see in pretty much every set, to 10, which are mechanics that, according to Marrow, would require a major miracle to make a return. I should say that the storm scale cares specifically about standard legal sets, which means even if a mechanic's a 10, a random one-off card could show up in a commander precon or some supplemental product, but for all intents and purposes, these mechanics, all of which rank a 10 on the storm scale, are very unlikely to ever make a return. Let's get to the mechanics. Storm. Considering that Storm is the mechanic that Marrow's Storm Scale is named after, this seems like the proper place to start. If you're not familiar with Storm, it's a mechanic that lets you copy your spell for each spell cast before it during the turn. It's also hilariously broken. Almost as soon as Storm first released back in Scourge in 2001, it caused major problems. The most busted Storm card, Mind's Desire, had to be banned just a week after it was released because people were using it to cast their entire decks as early as turn 1. Even with Mind's Desire banned, Storm still had a huge impact on the game. Tendrils of Agony is one of the best finishers in Legacy, while Grapeshot fuels Ruby Storm in Modern. So why is Storm so problematic? I think there's two big reasons. First, it's super hard to interact with outside of very narrow sideboard cards. Since most Storm cards are spells, to have any chance to interact, you're going to need a counter spell, and even counter spells don't really stop Storm, since even if you counter the original, all the extra Storm copies will still go on the stack and still resolve. Second, backed by fast mana, Storm can kill incredibly quickly, with legacy versions of Storm having potential to kill on turn 1, while modern Storm can kill on turn 2. This combination of being hard to stop and super fast is deadly, and it's a reason that we're never going to see Storm again, although on occasion, Wizards does print cards into Standard that essentially have Storm just not keyworded, with the most common being the ultimate of a Planeswalker like Rel or weird one-offs like Aetherflux Reservoir. Regenerate. For the first 20-ish years of Magic, Regenerate was a super common mechanic as a way to protect your creatures from removal. The way it works is, if you regenerate a creature, you basically get a shield so that the next time the creature would be destroyed during the turn, instead you lose the regeneration shield and the creature gets tapped but gets to live. At a glance, Regenerate seems pretty simple, but it led to a lot of confusion, especially among new players, who would try to regenerate their creature to save it from a sacrifice effect, which doesn't work, or an exile effect, which also doesn't work, or to think that their creature that was regenerated would get to reuse its enters the battlefield abilities, which also doesn't work, which is one of the big reasons why the mechanic got retired. The other reason that regeneration is gone is a shift in design philosophy. Rather than Regenerate, which was mostly a black and green mechanic, Wizards started printing effects that would let creatures gain indestructible until end of turn, which let Wizards change up the color pie and give a bunch of these effects to white. Later, Wizards brought back Phase Out as another way to protect your creatures, which let them move it into blue, so now pretty much every color, outside of maybe red, has a way to protect their creatures from removal and destruction. While we do occasionally get to see Regenerate used for flavor purposes, for example, on the new Wolverine legend, its days of being the primary way to protect your creatures from removal are long gone. Poisonous. The demise of Poisonous, which only exists on 2 cards in Virulent Sliver and Snake Called Initiation, is pretty simple. It's been power crept out of the game by a very similar mechanic in Toxic. The two mechanics are almost the same. If a creature with poisonous or toxic deals combat damage to a player, that player also gets a set number of poison counters, and once you get 10 poison counters, you lose the game. There are some slight differences between the two mechanics, with the biggest being that poisonous is a triggered ability, while toxic is a static ability. So if you have someone with a poisonous creature, it's going to put a trigger on the stack that will then give them the poison counters. Well, with toxic, your opponent just gets the poison counters at the same time as they're taking normal damage. But in reality, the two mechanics are basically the same thing. Considering that toxic is a 5 on the storm scale, which means we're likely to see it again in the future when the setting's right. If you're a fan of trying to win with poison counters, have no fear. Your time will come again. You'll just be being toxic rather than poisonous. Want to try to poison out your opponent? Well, you can get all the cards you need from our sponsor, Card Kingdom, over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. -0, -1 counters. This is another mechanic that's a remnant of the earliest years of Magic, when Wizards simply didn't have things figured out yet. Back in the early 90s, there were cards that gave -0, -1 counters, +2/+2 counters, +1/+0 counters, +1/+2 counters, and a bunch of other combinations. And this led to things being super messy, like how do you represent a card on the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter and a -1, -0 counter? It's not easy. So pretty quickly, Wizards realized that the game would be better and simpler if they standardized counters. So starting in the mid-90s, Wizards got rid of all the weird counters that could change the power and toughness of your creature, and decided they would only use +1/+1 or -1, -1 counters. And the game's definitely been better as a result, so the chances of going back seem pretty slim. Chroma. Speaking of mechanics, they got power crept out of the game. Back in Eventide, Wizards made Chroma, a mechanic that cared about the number of colored mana symbols on your cards. The mechanic flopped pretty hard, in part because most of the cards with Chroma weren't especially powerful, but it did have one major upside, which was it pushed players into building monocolored decks. Since if you played only a single color, it was much easier to overload on mana symbols of that color. If Chroma sounds vaguely familiar, that's because it was essentially the forerunner of the Devotion mechanic, which came a few years later in Theros. Devotion took what Chroma was trying to do, reward players for playing a bunch of cards with a bunch of mana symbols in one color, and simplified it by making it only apply to permanents on the battlefield. Some Chroma cards were super weird and had you counting mana symbols from cards you revealed from your library or in your hand, and the end result was that Devotion was an incredibly iconic and beloved mechanic. Even though Chroma's never coming back, I don't really think of it as a failure. Instead, it was a step in the process to eventually creating the great mechanic of Devotion. It's definitely true that most Chroma cards kinda suck, but next time you drain the table of the Grey Merchant of Asphodel, or make a ton of mana with the Nykthos, keep in mind you probably wouldn't have the awesomeness of Devotion if it wasn't for its older brother Chroma coming first to pave the way. Cumulative upkeep. Cumulative upkeep, that super fun mechanic that makes you pay an increasing amount of mana each turn to keep a card that you already played and paid for on the battlefield. Well, we've seen some unique use cases of this mechanic in the past, like on Braid of Fire. In practice, there are like 88 cards with cumulative upkeep in Magic, and maybe 2 of them in Mystic Remora and Glacial Chasm see any play at all, and really that's just in Commander. The problem with cumulative upkeep, and the reason it's not coming back, is twofold. First, it's not an especially strong mechanic. It turns out that having to pay an ever-increasing amount of mana to keep your permanents around isn't great, because you kind of want to use your mana for other cards. More importantly, the mechanic just feels bad to a lot of players for the same reason. In fact, not being fun is the reason that Mark Rosewater himself gave for putting the mechanic at a 10 on the storm scale. Well, this makes me a little bit sad because you can do some funny things with cards like Solemnity to keep the cumulative upkeep counters from accumulating. Considering how fun and underpowered the mechanic is, it's not really a big loss. Banding and bans with others. I've been playing Magic for 20 years now. I play for many hours each week. I write articles, I make videos. Magic is a massive part of my life, and in all honesty, I can't tell you how banding works. My experience with banding is something like this. If my opponent has a creature with banding on the battlefield and I attack into them, I'm gonna lose all my creatures somehow. I don't know why, but they're just all gonna die. Banding is another relic from the very early years of Magic. The last banding cards were printed in 1997's Weatherlight. To the best of my understanding, banding works something like this. If you have a creature with banding, you can sort of merge your other attacking or blocking creatures into a band with that creature, and then in combat, the player with banding gets to choose how the combat damage is distributed rather than the opponent. And I guess the idea is you can do some weird tricks in combat that maybe lets your creature survive or blows your opponent out, but the mechanic is so confusing and so lacking in power that no one plays it, and no one has for decades. Not only is the mechanic never coming back, but I'm not even convinced that Wizards could bring it back if they wanted to, because I'm not sure that they know how banding works any better than the rest of us do. Artifact lands. Honestly, out of all the mechanics on our list today, Artifact Lands is the mechanic that I think is most likely to return, despite what the Storm Scale says. The last time Mark Rosewater updated Artifact Lands on the Storm Scale was way back in 2018, and since then, we've seen Artifact Dual Lands in Modern Horizons, and even some one-off Artifact Lands like Treasure Vault in Standard. Will we ever get a full cycle of them in Standard like we did back in 2003's Mirrodin? Perhaps not, but it seems like they're not completely off limits despite what the Storm Scale says. So why are Artifact Lands considered to be so problematic? Well, there's two very different reasons. First, they have a long history of being super overpowered, backed by Arcbound Ravager, Disciple of the Vault, Skullclamp, and the Affinity for Artifacts mechanic. They basically broke Standard 20 years ago. With Affinity for Artifacts in specific, an Artifact Land is essentially a painless Ancient Tomb, since you get a mana discount for having the artifact on the battlefield, and can also tap it to make another mana. The original run of Affinity with Artifacts lands caused a ton of people to quit the game, to the point where you could argue that Artifact lands almost actually did kill Magic, and Wizards is hesitant to risk it again. The other problem with Artifact lands is they can lead to huge feel-bads for the person playing the Artifact lands. One of the biggest rules of modern Magic design is you can't blow up your opponent's lands, but Artifact lands turn any artifact destruction spell into a land destruction spell. Just imagine playing a deck full of Artifact lands when your opponent plays a Meltdown for a single mana and turns it into a one-sided Armageddon. Pretty fun, right? Basically, one of two things can happen with Artifact lands, and both of them are pretty bad. The player with the Artifact lands can use them to run away with the game thanks to their artifact synergies, or the player with the Artifact lands can do nothing in the game because their opponent keeps blowing up all their lands with artifact destruction spells, and this is why they are unlikely to ever come back in full. Although, as I mentioned before, I expect we're likely to see random one-off Artifact lands from time to time, like we have over the past few years. Ante. Speaking of relics from the earliest years of the game, we have Ante. Ante is a wild mechanic that only existed during the first 2 years of Magic, with the last Ante card printed being Temerian Fiends in 1995's Homelands. The idea of Ante was basically to turn a game of Magic into literal gambling. If you're playing for Ante, at the start of the game, each player flips the top card of their deck over into an Ante pile, and the winner of the game gets to keep all the Ante cards. Like forever, like you own them, they're yours now. Well, the idea of a 1995 Magic player randomly, accidentally anteing their Black Lotus that's worth like $500,000 today sounds pretty hilarious and absurd. You have to remember that the original idea of the game was a little bit different than how the game ended up. Richard Garfield has discussed how he didn't expect players to have huge collections of cards, and Ante was a way that you could keep cards moving around within a playgroup, which would discourage players from going all in to build the most busted and expensive deck possible, since there was always a risk that if you lost, you could lose some of your cards. Wizards pretty quickly realized that Ante might get them into trouble, and not just angry Magic players who lost their Black Lotus trouble, but like in trouble with the government for breaking gambling laws. As a result, they stopped printing Ante cards and banned all the ones that do exist from every format. They're so strict about this today that even when they hold a special event like the beta draft at Pro Tour 25th anniversary, they actually banned the Ante cards from being played, even though they would still show up in the packs. At this point, it's hard to imagine a scenario where Ante could ever return. Players don't want to risk losing their beloved cards, and Wizards doesn't want to risk Magic being labeled as gambling, and doubly so because booster packs do look an awful lot like gambling. As such, Ante will live forever as a weird quirk of Magic's earliest years that both players and Wizards would like to forget. And those are the mechanics that we're never going to see again. Do you think any of these mechanics could return? What else would you put on this list of never coming back mechanics? Let me know in the comments. And if you're looking for even more Magic, check out the video about the greatest place in the history of Magic the Gathering, or maybe the one where I ranked every single win the game card in the history of the game.